So you've asked your question on social media, it's perfectly phrased, and you're not getting an answer. What's going on? Well, let's go through the 10 reasons why maybe that answer isn't coming through. The first one could simply be contractual. Perhaps the person you've asked the question to is not allowed to answer. Perhaps the company that you're talking to is using someone else's IP and they have to get approval for every single question that they answer, and that approval isn't coming through. So simply just contractual legal requirements could limit their ability to answer your question. Similar to this is SEC regulations or other things related to the stock market and financial disclosure requirements. The SEC is the Security Exchange Commission, the regulatory body that manages the US stock markets. Under certain circumstances, information isn't allowed to be released because of its impact to the stock and the street. And so one of these things is specifically revenue recognition. So if you talk about something, indicate when something is going to be added to a product, for example, date a specific patch, it is possible for that to be considered a promise. And then, under very conservative interpretation of accounting law, you may not be allowed to actually recognize the revenue for the sale of that game until that patch is delivered. So under certain circumstances, dates in particular might not be questions that get answered because they might change the way that the accounting regulations are applied to a product. If revenue recognition sounds sort of silly or theoretical, I can tell you that I actually did this exact thing by accident on Dragon Age Inquisition. I provided a date for a patch on Twitter that was across the boundary of a fiscal quarter, and it triggered revenue recognition on Dragon Age Inquisition across that fiscal border. This was a big enough deal that years later, when EA was doing financial trading, they used that tweet as an example of what not to do when you were talking about different dates and products. Now, I believe EA has actually changed the way it does its accounting since then, so I'm not sure that that's still applicable, but at the time, it was a pretty big deal. Number 4 is pretty easy. Maybe we just don't know. Maybe we haven't decided. Maybe that we just don't know. Now, if we don't know, hopefully, ideally, you would hope that people would just tell you that, we don't know the answer to this question. But in some cases, especially around lore and things like that, the answer may not exist, but we don't want to indicate that that answer doesn't exist because it leaves the door open to future changes and manipulations. Number 5 is a particularly bad one, but not that uncommon. It's possible that the person that you've asked is trying to avoid some bad news. You've asked if this game will include elves, and the answer is no. And rather than just accepting and getting in front of and dealing with the consequence of that answer, they're choosing to avoid the answer, hoping that maybe they'll find a better way to answer it at a future time. This rarely works. It's not a good approach. It's not a good strategy, but it's not an uncommon thing for people to do, is to avoid answers for things where they know the answer they're going to give you isn't the answer you want to hear. Let me strengthen that up a little bit. Not only does avoiding bad news rarely work as a strategy, it almost always backfires. By delaying that answer, you're avoiding an opportunity to start to move past the bad news and on to new news. You're tensioning a spring, as it were, and the longer you wait, the longer you avoid those questions, the worse the fallout from the answer is going to be when you ultimately give it in almost all cases. Number 6 is you were a jerk. You asked the question in a way that they don't want to answer you. You were inappropriate or rude or aggressive, and that's not a good way to answer a question. Treat the people you're asking questions of like people if you want to get an answer. Simple as that. If you've done this, if you've crossed a line, I'm sorry to tell you, chances are you're not getting an answer. The person you've asked is under no obligation to answer your question, and if you've been inappropriate or crossed a line, chances are no matter how you attempt to re-engage with them, that interaction is over. Walk away from it. Let it go. Number 7 is simply that maybe your question got lost in the noise. During Anthem, I was getting sometimes hundreds of questions a day. It's possible that your question simply got lost in the noise. In that circumstance, if you're careful, you might want to ask your question again. However, I will caution you, because another reason why your question might not be getting answered is number 8, that you were just being too spammy. This is particularly true for someone like me, and if we ever do a live stream AMA, I will tell you right now, if you ask that same question over and over and over again, I will not answer that question simply out of spite. So don't be spammy, because that's not a good way to get people to pay attention to you. That's pushing you back into the don't be a jerk territory. It's possible that the question you're asking has already been answered. And in this case, maybe they're just tired of answering it over and over again. Maybe they're also trying to avoid the narrative to shifting to being about this particular question. If the same question gets asked and answered over and over again, it starts to shape what people perceive the product as being about. So there can reach a point where the decision is made to stop answering a particular question or kind of question simply because the question has been asked and answered before, and they want to move the narrative on to something else. So in that case, do your due diligence, look to see if this question has already been answered in the past. And then number 10, maybe it's a surprise. Maybe you're asking a question and the answer to that would be a spoiler or something else that would be better done at a future date where it can surprise and delight people. Now, often I would say that if people aren't answering a question, seems pretty innocuous, chances are it's this one, that it's a surprise. Little trick here. If you're asking a question and the answer, like, does this game take place on the planet Neptune? If the answer is no, they're probably just going to say no. So if they're not answering you, and it's a yes or no question, there's a good chance maybe the answer is actually yes, and they're trying to avoid that spoiler. And I thought that I would do a bonus one. This is something I've encountered a few times. The reason that you're not getting an answer, especially on a platform like Twitter, where there's very little available space for an answer, might simply be that the question is so far off base that there's no answer that really makes sense. If you ask a question like, in Mass Effect, when I create a dwarf during my origin, do my webbed feet come in the color blue? How do you answer that? It's wrong on so many different levels and starts from such an illogical starting point that it's almost impossible to even begin to answer that question. There you are, 11 reasons why your question isn't getting answered. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully this was informative. If it was, think about giving this video a like. If you are a social media manager or you just have a lot of friends that ask a lot of questions on Twitter, maybe think about sharing this video with them. If you have any other thoughts, let me know down in the comments. Share your suggestions for good ways to ask questions or good ways to answer them. Social media can be emotionally draining on both sides, so good luck out there. Try to be nice to each other. I'll see you again soon. Thank you.